Yes, pivots. Pivots. First thing that comes to mind to anyone that is about to start his journey with Unreal Engine. How they work, how Unreal handles them. Sit tight and listen. I tell you how. It turns out that those who have some experience with traditional 3D applications, such as Maya or Blender, may be surprised to find that Unreal has very limited options for pivots manipulations. Essentially, the proper workflow is to create an asset with the pivot at the center of coordinate system, at the scene's origin, as it will be imported into Unreal in this way. From this imported asset, we can then create scenes or levels within Unreal. The issue arises when we have more complex object or even a whole scene, such as level, that we want to import into Unreal. In this case, each object is imported individually as a separate asset, with the pivot placed at the center of coordinate system, often far from the objects it controls. Fortunately, there are few tools and options available to help us manage this problem. If we want to change the location of the pivot, we can hold down the Alt key and middle click on the object where we want the pivot to be. The pivot will appear on the surface of geometry at the point where we clicked. And if you have snapping to the grid enabled, as shown here at 50 units, the pivots will be snapped to the nearest point on the grid. If we now undo the operation, or select the different object and return to the previous object where we modified the pivot, we will find that the pivot were temporarily changed and has returned to the point it was at the very beginning before our modifications. If we want to permanently change the location of our pivot, we can set the pivot location and then right-click and choose Pivot, Set Pivot Offset. Now, when we return to our object, the pivot will remain at the location we selected. Additionally, in the Details panel, in the Actor section, there is Pivot Offset values that give us direct numerical controls over the position of our pivots, and we can change them here. Unfortunately, these values do not update in real time, so we must change the values, unselect the object, and reselect it to see the pivot move to its updated position. It is not the most intuitive method, but it's a more precise and numerical way to change the pivot position of our objects. So far, all the pivot changes we made have only affected the instance of the asset in our scene. If we import the asset back to our scene, we will find that the pivot is the center of the coordinate system, as it was at the beginning, because its position was only changed for the instance in our scene, not for the main asset. Of course, we can also change the pivot for the main asset. To do this, we need to use Modeling panel. In this panel, we select Pivot, and then we use predefined buttons to determine where our pivot should be located. We can also manually drag it to any location in the window by hand. And if we have grid snapping enabled, it will behave like any other object and will be attracted to the nearest point on the grid. Once we are satisfied with the location of our pivot, we can accept our changes by clicking the Accept button at the bottom of the window. After importing the asset into the scene, the pivot will be exactly where we set it. When changing pivots for the asset that have already been placed in the scene, we need to consider the position of this asset will change as the result, as shown here. This is because their position is defined relative to the pivot that has just been changed and is now in different location. For example, if we change the pivot again and also rotate it, such as by snapping and aligning it to the surface like this and saving our changes, all of our objects in our scene that we previously set will be rotated. They will no longer be in the same location and orientation as before. That's why it's best to make such asset modification on the fresh scene immediately after importing the geometry, before we have placed many of its instances in our scene. The problem arises when we want to change the pivot of multiple objects at once. In this case, we select several objects, and if we use the modeling mode to center our pivot, it will set in the same location for each object at the geometric center of all selected static meshes. The selected meshes are treated as one object when calculating the pivot position, rather than as individual separate objects. To solve this problem, we can use paid add-on Pivot tool. It gives us many options for manipulating pivots for both instances and the main asset. We can center, snap to the sides of bounding box, to its corners or edges. Once we have chosen our pivot, clicking the Bake button will bake it into main asset. If we now import the asset from the content browser, the pivots will be where we set them to be. Another problem is that if we have the whole object made of many separate parts for which we changed the pivot location and now we want to be assembled exactly the same as we created it in the 3D program, unfortunately, we no longer have this option because each object will be placed at the center of the coordinate system with its pivot centered. We therefore need to decide in advance if we want to change the pivots for the main asset or just for the instance. Changing the pivot for the asset makes sense when, for example, we import many objects that were placed in another 3D program, but their transformation was not zeroed out. For example, 10 trees spread out in 3D space that will be imported as separate asset. Then we will change their pivots and conveniently arrange them in the scene in Unreal. This way we can fix this problem without jumping to another software. Alternatively, we can import the entire object or scene into a level and then change their pivots. They will be in the right place and at the same time each of the assets will have the pivots in the more convenient and logical place. Another option, not necessarily pivot modification, but a certain type of organizing in the scene, is to import the FBX file directly into the level. We do this by choosing File, Import into Level, and we will see a slightly different window than where importing an asset from the FBX file. And in our level, instead of many objects, there will be just one, which unfortunately we cannot directly modify its transformation, like translate or scale, just like in normal object. But we have access to each of these object static meshes in Detail panel. We can, for example, scale up all these meshes or modify them. We can also modify their pivot position in modeling mode. Unfortunately, in this list of meshes, we cannot use this pivot tool add-on. It's not the perfect solution, but it gives us some additional option that may be better in certain situation than importing an individual objects and cluttering entire scene. Although it's probably a better solution to import all of the objects into the level and then parent them to one main mesh that we will use to control its transformation. This is more convenient and give us a bit easier control, but it is not as clean in the outliner.